A nation's soul is often forged on the battlefield. We are about to walk through 30 key battles of the Welsh Wars, a centuries-long struggle that pitted the defiant princes of Wales against the overwhelming power of the English crown. By the end, you will understand the brilliant tactics, heartbreaking betrayals, and enduring mysteries that decided the fate of an entire culture. We will see how a single ambush in a misty wood could shatter an army, and why a vanished leader became a ghost haunting history. What does it truly mean for a people to fight for their home? The year 1081 dawned on a fractured and vulnerable Wales. For generations, the land had been a patchwork of rival kingdoms, their princes locked in a cycle of alliance and betrayal. This internal division created an opening, a crack in the fortress wall through which a new and formidable power was about to step. The stage for this turning point was a windswept hill called Mynydd Carn. Here, two Welsh princes, Gruffydd ap Cynan and Rhys ap Tewdwr, clashed in a brutal struggle for supremacy in the south. But this was not merely another chapter in an old Welsh feud. Watching from the shadows and perhaps even participating directly were knights of a different breed. These were the Normans, led by figures like Robert of Rhuddlan, hardened veterans of the conquest of England who had already begun building their own stone castles along the Welsh border. Their presence at Mynydd Carn, whether as mercenaries or opportunistic allies, signaled a profound shift. The battle itself was a savage affair, a close-quarters melee where the fate of kingdoms was decided by sword and spear. When the dust settled, Rhys ap Tewdwr emerged victorious, but his triumph came with a heavy and revealing price. To secure his position, he soon afterward traveled to the court of William the Conqueror and formally submitted to him, receiving his kingdom back as a grant from the English crown. In that single act, the true consequence of Mynydd Carn became clear. It had consolidated power, yes, but for the first time it formally acknowledged a higher foreign authority over a Welsh ruler. The battle did not push the Normans out, it invited them further in, establishing a dangerous precedent of client kingship. Rhys ap Tewdwr became, in effect, a guardian of the border for William, a Welsh prince whose power now depended on English favour. This delicate and fraught arrangement would define the coming century, proving that the greatest threats to Wales often came not from across the sea, but through the doors opened by its own internal strife. The precedent set at Mynydd Carn would haunt Wales for decades as Norman lords, now firmly entrenched along the border, looked hungrily westward. But the story of a people is never one of simple conquest. It is a rhythm of push and pull, of advance and shocking reversal. And in the autumn of 1136, near a hill called Crugmawr just outside Cardigan, the rhythm swung violently back in Wales's favour. The Normans had grown confident, their expansion seeming inevitable. A large force, a mix of mailed knights and infantry, marched into Ceredigion, expecting to crush any resistance. What they met was something entirely different. The Welsh princes, for once, had united. Owain Glyndŵr from the north and Gruffydd ap Rhys from the south combined their armies, choosing their ground with brilliant care. They funneled the Norman host toward the steep slopes of Crugmawr, where the terrain itself became a weapon. And then, from the cover of the woods and hillsides, a new sound filled the air, the deadly whisper of hundreds of Welsh longbows. This was not the crossbow of the Normans, a slower, mechanical weapon. The longbow was a part of the Welsh warrior, a swift and devastating instrument that could launch a storm of arrows capable of piercing chainmail at a frightening rate. At Crugmawr, that storm broke. The Norman cavalry, the pride of their army, found themselves trapped on boggy ground, their horses stumbling as arrows fell like rain. The charge, their greatest tactic, was impossible. Panic spread instantly. The disciplined ranks dissolved into a chaotic scramble, knights falling from their saddles, infantry breaking formation. The Welsh infantry, armed with long spears and a fierce knowledge of the land, then swept down from the heights to finish the work. It was not a battle, it was an annihilation. The psychological impact of this victory cannot be overstated. For a generation, the Normans had seemed unstoppable, their stone castles symbols of permanent power. Crugmawr proved they could be not just beaten but utterly destroyed. The news raced through Wales like a wildfire, igniting rebellions across the land. The most immediate prize was the rich territory of Ceredigion, which was swiftly recaptured by the Welsh, rolling back the Norman frontier by miles. For a few glorious years, it felt as though the tide of history had turned. But such moments of unity are fragile, and the echo of those longbow strings would soon be met by the sound of a different kind of construction, the relentless chisel of stone on stone, as a new and more formidable strategy arose from the English crown. The triumph at Crugmawr was a beacon, but beacons eventually fade. The Welsh princes, flush with victory, soon returned to their old rivalries, their hard-won unity dissolving like mist in the morning sun. And in their division, they created an opening for a king who would not be so easily discouraged. Henry II, a ruler of immense ambition and a newly secured English crown, looked west and saw not a nation but a problem to be solved. In the summer of 1157, he marched into Wales at the head of a colossal feudal host, the largest army seen in Britain since the Norman conquest itself. His target was Owain Glyndŵr, the Prince of Gwynedd, whose power had grown formidable in the north. Henry's plan was straightforward, a hammer blow of conventional warfare, to march up the coast road and crush Owain in open battle. But Owain was a master of a different kind of war. He refused to meet the English king on his terms. Instead, he melted into the landscape, ordering a scorched earth retreat that left Henry's vast army starving in a barren land. Then Owain guided the frustrated English into a trap, the dense, shadowy forests of the Ceiriog Valley. This was the Welsh battlefield perfected, a place where numbers and heavy cavalry were worse than useless. They were a liability. As Henry's forces struggled through the narrow tracks, a storm of arrows erupted from the invisible tree line. Welsh spearmen, moving like ghosts through the undergrowth, launched hit-and-run attacks on the strung-out column. Chaos erupted. In the confusion, a party of Welsh soldiers broke through the royal guard and came within a sword's length of King Henry himself. The king only narrowly escaped capture or death, a moment of sheer terror for the most powerful man in Britain. The Battle of Coleshill, as it became known, was not a traditional clash of armies. It was a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. Henry's grand invasion, meant to be a display of overwhelming force, had been humiliated by terrain and tactics. Forced to retreat, he had no choice but to negotiate. The resulting truce was a stunning acknowledgement of Welsh strength. Owain Glyndŵr was recognized as the undisputed ruler of Gwynedd, and while he technically paid homage to Henry, he retained virtual independence. The king had marched in to conquer, but he marched out having confirmed a Welsh prince's sovereignty. It was a victory forged not on an open field, but in the whispering darkness of an ancient forest, proving that sometimes the land itself could be the most powerful army of all. Yet the peace won at Coleshill was a tense and watchful one. A decade later, Owain Glyndŵr decided to shift from brilliant defense to audacious offense. His target was not an army in the field, but the very symbol of Norman occupation, the great castle of Rhuddlan. Perched on a steep bluff overlooking the river Clwyd, Rhuddlan was more than just stone and mortar, it was a statement. It controlled the Perfedwlad, the Middle Country, a belt of incredibly fertile land that was the breadbasket of North Wales and the key to all movement between the coast and the interior. Whoever held Rhuddlan held the region in a vise. For Owain, capturing it would be the ultimate declaration that the truce with Henry II was over, and that Welsh sovereignty was not just defensive but expansive. The siege that began in 1167 was a masterstroke of planning. Owain knew a direct assault on such a formidable fortress would be suicide. Instead, he used the landscape as his chief weapon. His forces surrounded the castle, cutting it off from any hope of relief or resupply. but the real genius was in how he controlled the river. The Clwyd was Rhuddlan's lifeline, bringing in food and reinforcements by boat. Owain's men built fortifications and placed archers along the banks, effectively blockading the waterway. Within the castle walls, the Norman garrison watched their supplies dwindle. As weeks turned into months, hunger and despair set in. A castle is only as strong as the morale of the men inside it, and under the relentless, patient pressure of Owain's siege, that morale crumbled. Finally, with no hope left, the garrison surrendered. The gates of the mighty fortress swung open not to an English king, but to a Welsh prince. The capture of Rhuddlan sent a shockwave through both Wales and England. Politically, it was a thunderclap. It proved that Welsh princes could not only win battles in their mountains, but could also take the fight to the enemy's strongest points and win. It showed a new level of strategic patience and engineering skill, moving beyond ambush to sustained siege warfare. For the people of the Perfect Lad, it meant liberation from foreign lords and the restoration of Welsh law and custom. Owain Glyndŵr didn't just capture a castle, he reclaimed a heartland. The message was unmistakable, the resurgence was real, and the map of power in Wales had been redrawn, not with ink, but with the silent, stubborn will of a people reclaiming their home one stone at a time. The capture of Rhuddlan had proven the Welsh could seize the initiative, but that confidence would soon meet a brutal and sobering reality. Just over 30 years later, on a wide, rolling plain near the border fortress of Painscastle, the very tactics that had saved Wales would lead to its most catastrophic defeat in a generation. The year was 1198, and the architect of this disaster was Gwenwyn ab Owain, the ambitious Prince of Powys. He had gathered a vast host, perhaps the largest Welsh army assembled since the days of his grandfather, with a bold aim to smash the English border lords and expand his power southward. His target was Painscastle, a formidable stone keep held for the English crown, but the English were not caught sleeping. The king's chief minister, the Justiciar Geoffrey Fitz-Peter, reacted with stunning speed, marching a professional army of knights and men-at-arms to relieve the siege. What happened next was a fatal miscalculation. Instead of retreating into the hills or forcing the English into broken ground, Gwenwyn, perhaps overconfident from past successes, chose to meet them on the open field. It was a decision that played directly into the greatest strength of the English military, the massed charge of armored knights. On that open plain, the Welsh infantry, brave and numerous, formed their traditional shield wall. But they had no answer for the thunderous impact of hundreds of mounted knights in full armor, lances lowered, hitting their line at a full gallop. The ground itself seemed to shake. The shield wall, which could deflect arrows and hold against infantry, shattered like glass under that concentrated force. The Welsh lines were broken, then surrounded, and then butchered. The chronicles speak of a slaughter so complete it was remembered with horror for centuries, with Welsh losses numbered in the thousands. The Battle of Painscastle was more than a lost battle, it was a strategic earthquake. It utterly destroyed the military power of Gwenwyn, and more importantly, it broke the back of the great southern kingdom of Deheubarth, which had been the heart of Welsh resistance since the time of Lord Rhys. With its army gone and its leadership in disarray, Deheubarth fractured into smaller, weaker lordships, unable to coordinate a unified defense. The English, sensing this profound weakness, pushed their advantage, building new castles and tightening their grip on the border. Painscastle became a grim lesson, a warning etched in blood. It proved that Welsh courage and numbers were meaningless if they fought on the enemy's terms. The open field was a death trap, and the heavy cavalry charge was a weapon for which they had no counter. In the aftermath, the dream of a unified Wales receded, replaced by a landscape of vulnerable, divided territories. The question now hung heavy in the air: if they could not win in the open, and if their unity was broken, what path to survival remained? The crushing defeat at Painscastle created a power vacuum, a silence that begged to be filled. But in the very next year, 1199, the decisive struggle for Wales's future did not occur on a bloody border plain. It was fought in the heart of Gwynedd, along the banks of the Conwy River, in a clash that revealed an even more dangerous enemy than the English crown, the Welsh themselves. This was the Battle of Aberconwy, a civil war between uncle and nephew for the soul of the north. On one side stood Dafydd ab Owain, a prince who had ruled for years but whose power was seen by many as stagnant, too comfortable with the status quo. On the other was his young nephew, Llywelyn ap Iorwerth, a man whose ambition burned with a fierce new light. Llywelyn was not content with a fragment of his grandfather's legacy. He wanted it all, and he wanted a Wales that could stand united. The forces met near the strategic crossing of the Conwy. It was a brutal, intimate conflict, Welshman against Welshman, where every face in the shield wall might have been familiar. Llywelyn's victory was decisive. He shattered his uncle's army and forced Dafydd into permanent exile, effectively erasing him from the political map. With this single battle, Llywelyn did not just win a kingdom, he consolidated one. He swept away the fractured, shared rule that had weakened Gwynedd for a generation and established himself as its sole, undisputed master. This internal consolidation was the essential first step, the foundation upon which everything else would be built. A divided house cannot withstand a storm, so Llywelyn first made his house whole. But his genius lay in knowing that the sword alone was not enough. In the years following Aberconwy, he embarked on a masterful campaign of diplomacy, weaving a web of alliances through strategic marriages. He married Joan, the illegitimate but recognized daughter of King John of England, a move that gave him a direct line to the English court and a powerful protector, at least for a time. He married his own daughters to other Welsh princes, binding their families to his own and turning potential rivals into relatives. He was building a network, a system of loyalty that was more resilient than force alone. Aberconwy was the spark, the moment a leader emerged from the chaos of civil war. It proved that the path to saving Wales began not with fighting the English, but with uniting the Welsh. Llywelyn had secured his backyard. Now, with a solid base of power and a growing web of influence, he was ready to look outward, to challenge the very map that Painscastle had seemed to set in stone. The question shifted from one of survival to one of ambition. How far could a truly united Wales expand? Llywelyn ap Iorwerth's legacy of a united Gwynedd did not last beyond his own life. Upon his death, the old curse of division returned with a vengeance as his grandsons tore the kingdom apart in a bitter squabble for power. By 1255, Gwynedd was split 3 ways between brothers, a fragile and fractured state that invited disaster. But on a lonely ridge called Bryn Derwen, one brother would shatter this arrangement and set in motion the final, desperate attempt to forge a Welsh nation. The young Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, known to history as Llywelyn the Last, faced his elder brothers Owain and Dafydd. They had conspired to marginalize him, leaving him with only a sliver of land. Llywelyn, however, possessed a quality they fatally underestimated, a burning sense of destiny and a willingness to act with shocking speed. He gathered his small band of loyal followers and marched to confront the combined forces of his brothers. Bryn Derwen was not a grand, set-piece battle with thousands of men. It was a sharp, brutal clash of Welshmen on Welsh soil, a family feud fought with the cold steel of political survival. Llywelyn's tactics were those of a gambler who knows he has only one chance. He chose the ground, likely using the ridge's slope to his advantage, and launched a furious, concentrated assault on a key point in his brother's line. The fighting was fierce and personal, but Llywelyn's ferocity and the loyalty of his men carried the day. His brother's alliance crumbled under the unexpected violence of the attack. Owain was captured on the field, and Dafydd was sent fleeing into exile. In one afternoon, the divided kingdom was suddenly whole again, under the sole command of a 25-year-old prince. Bryn Derwen was more than a victory in a civil war. It was the forge in which a national leader was tempered. With Gwynedd consolidated, Llywelyn turned his gaze to the rest of Wales. He embarked on a campaign of expansion and diplomacy so successful that, just a decade later, he achieved the unthinkable. In the Treaty of Montgomery of 1267, the English king, Henry III, formally recognized Llywelyn ap Gruffudd not just as a local lord but as the Prince of Wales. This was a title acknowledging his authority over almost the entire country, a diplomatic triumph that made him the first and only Welsh ruler to hold such a recognized position. That title, Prince of Wales, was born from the bloody resolution of a family fight on a windswept ridge. It was the pinnacle of Welsh political ambition, a dream made real by treaty and sealed with a royal seal. But crowns granted by foreign kings can be taken away, and the man who granted this one would soon be succeeded by a son of a very different character, a king who saw treaties not as sacred bonds but as temporary inconveniences. But a title on parchment meant nothing without the power to defend it. Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, the newly recognized Prince of Wales, knew his authority would be tested, and he chose not to wait for the blow to fall. In the summer of 1257, he struck first, launching a campaign into the south that would culminate in a battle of perfect ambush, the Battle of Cymarau. His target was the restoration of Welsh control over the ancient kingdom of Deheubarth, lands long dominated by powerful English marcher lords. An English army, led by the experienced commander Stephen Borzan, marched out to meet this challenge, confident in their numbers and their heavy cavalry. They were marching into a trap meticulously laid by the land itself. The Welsh forces, a coalition loyal to Llywelyn, lured Borzan's column toward the river Tywys, into a landscape of hidden bogs and soft, waterlogged ground near the village of Cymarau. This was not an open field where knights could charge. It was a quagmire waiting to be sprung. As the English advanced, their horses began to sink, their heavy armor becoming a fatal liability. The charge, their greatest weapon, was impossible. At that moment of maximum confusion and vulnerability, the Welsh attacked from all sides. Arrows flew from concealed positions in the woods, and spearmen swept down from the firmer high ground, hitting the immobilized English column in coordinated waves. Borzan's army was not just defeated, it was enveloped and destroyed. Stephen Borzan himself was killed in the fighting, a clear signal of the totality of the Welsh victory. The political shockwaves were immediate and profound. With this single battle, Llywelyn ap Gruffudd demonstrated he was not just a prince in name, but a warlord of formidable capability. The victory at Cymarau shattered English power in the region, allowing Llywelyn to sweep through Deheubarth, reclaiming castles and territories with ease. Local Welsh lords, seeing the tide turn, rushed to swear allegiance to him. More importantly, the marcher lords along the border, those aggressive barons who had carved out their own mini-kingdoms, were suddenly intimidated. The man who had destroyed Borzan's professional army was now their neighbor, and his gaze was fixed on their lands. Cymarau was the brutal, practical enforcement of the Treaty of Montgomery. It proved Llywelyn could project power across the entire length of Wales, uniting north and south in a common military cause. For a fleeting moment, the dream of a truly unified Wales under a single sovereign prince seemed not just possible but inevitable. But such dramatic rises are often watched by enemies who are patient, calculating, and far more powerful. The echo of Welsh triumph at Cymarau would soon reach a new king in London, a ruler who viewed the very existence of a powerful Prince of Wales not as a diplomatic fact but as a personal insult to his crown. The triumph at Cymarau was a high watermark, but tides always recede. Llywelyn ap Gruffudd's power now faced a king who viewed compromise as weakness. Edward I, a monarch of iron will and boundless resources, had decided the Prince of Wales was an anomaly that could not be allowed to stand. By 1282, the final conquest had begun, a war of brutal attrition where Edward's vast armies and endless supply trains ground slowly, inexorably into the Welsh heartland. Yet in this dark hour, a flash of brilliant defiance erupted on the treacherous waters of the Menai Strait. The Battle of Moel Wide Don is a story of local genius meeting imperial overconfidence. Edward's strategy was a classic pincer movement to crush Gwynedd from both east and west. To achieve this, he needed to ferry a large contingent of troops from his base on Anglesey across the strait to the mainland. The Menai is no gentle river, its currents are swift and deceptive, its tides unpredictable. The English solution was a feat of medieval engineering, a floating pontoon bridge constructed from boats lashed together with planks, creating a precarious pathway over the water. It was a bold plan, underestimating both the environment and the enemy watching from the opposite shore. The Welsh commander, possibly Llywelyn's brother Dafydd, understood something the English engineers did not. He waited for the perfect moment when the English vanguard was midway across the unstable bridge, their formation compressed and utterly vulnerable. Then he struck. A storm of arrows arched out from the mainland, peppering the crowded soldiers who had nowhere to hide. Longboats packed with Welsh spearmen darted out from hidden inlets, slamming into the pontoon bridge, hacking at its ropes and planks. Chaos was instantaneous and absolute. The bridge, shuddering under the weight of men and the force of the attack, began to break apart. Fully armored knights and infantry tumbled into the churning, cold waters of the strait. Weighed down by their mail, hundreds drowned within sight of both shores. Those who made it to the Welsh side were cut down on the beach. It was a slaughter, a stunning tactical masterpiece that annihilated an entire English division. In that moment, it must have felt like another Cymarau, a miraculous victory snatched from the jaws of defeat. But this was 1282, not 1257. Edward I was not Stephen Bozen, and his resolve was not so easily broken. The victory at Moel Wide Don, while spectacular, was ultimately a delay, not a reversal. Edward simply absorbed the loss, tightened his grip on Anglesey, and continued his relentless, methodical advance from the east. The Welsh had won a battle, but they were losing the war of supply, of manpower, of sheer endurance. The strait could be crossed another day with more boats, more care. The real tragedy of Moel Wide Don is that it proved even the most perfect ambush could not stop the inevitable when faced with an enemy whose resources seemed as deep as the sea itself. The flash of hope on the water only made the gathering darkness on land feel more complete. Moel Wide Don was a defiant spark, but the fire of Welsh resistance was running out of fuel. By the spring of 1283, the great castles of Gwynedd had fallen one by one, and Prince Llywelyn was dead, killed in a chance ambush months before. His brother, Dafydd ap Gruffudd, was now the last prince standing, a fugitive in his own land with nowhere left to run but into the wild, mountainous heart of Meirionydd. Here, perched on a stark, rocky outcrop in the valley of the Diceny, stood Castle y Bera. This was not a Norman fortress, it was a purely Welsh castle, built by Llywelyn the Great decades earlier, and its design was a masterpiece of adaptation to the landscape. Instead of the classic Norman rectangular keep, it had a unique triangular shape following the contours of the crag. Its walls were integrated directly into the natural rock, making it appear as if the mountain itself had grown fortifications. For Dafydd and his dwindling band of loyal followers, it was the final redoubt, the last place in all of Gwynedd where the flag of an independent Wales still flew. Edward I's response was methodical and overwhelming. He understood that taking this symbol was as important as taking the man. He dispatched a powerful force, not just to besiege the castle, but to obliterate it. They brought the full might of medieval siegecraft to this remote valley. Massive wooden trebuchets, the artillery of their age, were painstakingly assembled. These giant catapults could hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds, not just at the walls, but in high arcs over them, smashing into the inner courtyards and wooden buildings where the defenders lived. Day and night, the bombardment continued, a relentless, thunderous assault that would have shaken the very bones of the mountain. the castle's innovative design, so perfect for defying a conventional assault, was less effective against this sustained, long-range pounding. The garrison, hopelessly outnumbered and watching their fortress crumble around them, held out with desperate courage, but courage could not stop flying stone. After a siege of several weeks, the end came. Under cover of the relentless artillery fire, English soldiers stormed the breached walls. Stafford himself, perhaps sensing the inevitable, had already slipped away into the surrounding hills, but his last stronghold was gone. The fall of Castle Wybera was not merely a military defeat, it was a funeral for a nation. It marked the absolute final end of native Welsh rule. Independent Gwynedd, a kingdom that had endured for centuries, ceased to exist on that day. Stafford's freedom was short-lived. Betrayed and captured a few months later, he was taken to Shrewsbury, where Edward made an example of him. His execution was a brutal piece of political theatre, drawn and quartered as a traitor to a crown he had never sworn to uphold. With him died the last direct claimant to a sovereign Wales. Edward then moved swiftly to ensure it could never rise again. In 1284, he issued the Statute of Rhuddlan, formally annexing the territories of the Welsh princes into the Kingdom of England. Welsh law, the ancient codes that defined the society, was abolished and replaced with English common law. New counties were carved out, governed by English sheriffs. The conquest was now complete, not just in territory, but in law and administration. The land of the princes had become a mere possession of the English crown, its destiny seemingly sealed under a foreign statute. Yet in the ashes of that conquest, a different kind of story was waiting to be told, one not of princes and statutes, but of the simmering discontent of ordinary people pushed to their limit. The silence that followed the Statute of Rhuddlan was not peaceful, it was the quiet of a smoldering fire. For over a decade, the weight of English rule pressed down on Wales, a burden felt in every new tax, every foreign sheriff, and every towering stone castle that scarred the horizon. But in 1294, that fire burst into open flame. The rebellion that erupted was not led by a surviving prince, but by a distant cousin of the old royal house, a man named Madog ap Llywelyn. He claimed the vacant title of Prince of Wales, and for a brief, furious year, his uprising swept across the land, capturing key castles and throwing English administration into chaos. It was the People's War, a final, desperate attempt to reclaim what had been lost, and it would meet its end on a cold March day in 1295 on a field called Mynydd in Powys. The English response, led by the experienced Earl of Warwick, was a lesson in cold, professional military doctrine. Warwick had learned from decades of fighting the Welsh. He refused to be drawn into the hills or the forests. Instead, he maneuvered his army to force Madog's rebels to fight on a field of his choosing, an open space where Welsh mobility and knowledge of the terrain would count for little. When the two armies met at Mynydd, the contrast was stark. The Welsh host, though large and filled with passionate fury, was a gathering of local levies, brave but undisciplined. Warwick's force was a machine. At its core was a new and terrifying innovation, the coordinated use of massed English longbowmen. This was not the sporadic arrow fire of past battles. Warwick deployed his archers in disciplined ranks, and they unleashed a storm of arrows so dense and continuous it was said to darken the sky. The Welsh, used to the swift, individual shots of their own bowmen, had never faced a volley of this scale and ferocity. Their charge, the heart of their attack, was broken before it could even truly begin. Men and horses fell in waves under the relentless hail. Then, as the Welsh lines wavered and thinned, Warwick sent in his armored men-at-arms to finish the work. The battle was less a clash than a systematic dismantling. Madog's army was routed, and he himself was captured soon after, his dream of a restored principality extinguished on that bloody field. The aftermath of Mynydd was absolute. It crushed the last organized, nationwide rebellion against Edward's conquest. Any lingering hope that English rule could be shaken off by force of arms died there. For King Edward, the victory was the final justification for his grand, oppressive strategy. He accelerated his castle-building program to an unprecedented scale, constructing the magnificent and intimidating stone fortresses at Conwy, Caernarfon, Harlech, and Beaumaris. These were not just military bases, they were permanent statements of power, designed to dominate the landscape and the people psychologically. They were built to be supplied by sea, making them immune to local siege, and their sheer architectural grandeur was meant to awe the Welsh into submission. Mies Moydog proved the rebellion was over, and Edward's iron ring of castles ensured it would never begin again. The conquest was now cemented in stone, a fact of life for generations to come. Yet, even in this total defeat, a seed was planted on that field. The devastating tactic of massed longbowmen, first perfected against the Welsh at Mies Moydog, would be harvested decades later on the battlefields of France at Crécy and Agincourt, changing the face of European warfare forever. The weapon that helped subjugate Wales would go on to make England a continental power. Stone castles cast long shadows, but they could not extinguish the memory of freedom. A generation after Mies Moydog, the embers of resistance still glowed, waiting for a spark. That spark came in the bitter winter of 1316, not from a prince of the old blood, but from a nobleman of Glamorgan named Llywelyn Bren. His was a revolt born of personal injustice, a protest against the harsh and corrupt rule of the local English royal administrator. But his grievance quickly became a national cause, drawing support from across South Wales, a clear sign that the conquest had not erased a people's desire for self-rule. The first major clash of this rebellion, the Battle of Llywelyn, was a masterpiece of asymmetric warfare, a reminder that the old ways could still bleed the new order. Llywelyn Bren knew he could not face the English garrisons in open battle. Instead, he targeted their lifeline, the supply convoy, a large train of wagons loaded with food, weapons, and pay for the soldiers holding Swansea Castle, was making its way through the narrow, wooded valley of the river Llywelyn. The terrain was perfect for an ambush, with the road hemmed in by dense forest and steep slopes. Bren positioned his men in the trees and on the high ground, hidden and silent. As the English column, its guards likely complacent on a routine journey, stretched out along the valley floor, the attack erupted. Arrows whistled down from invisible archers, striking drivers and horses. Welsh spearmen, screaming from the undergrowth, surged onto the road, splitting the convoy into panicked, isolated segments. The fighting was close, brutal, and utterly one-sided. The English guards were overwhelmed, the wagons looted or burned, and the vital supplies destined for Swansea were lost. The victory at Llywelyn was a stunning tactical success. It proved that even 20 years after the conquest, Welsh forces could still move with secrecy and strike with devastating effect. It provided Llywelyn Bren's rebels with crucial weapons, armor, and morale, fueling the spread of the uprising. For a moment, it seemed the old fire might truly reignite, but the English crown had built its castles for precisely this scenario. When direct confrontation failed, they retreated behind walls of stone. Llywelyn Bren's next logical target was the great fortress of Caerphilly, the mightiest castle in the south, but here the hard lesson of the new reality set in. His forces, brilliant in the woods, had no answer for Caerphilly's immense concentric walls and water defenses. They could besiege it, but they could not hope to storm it. The siege dragged on, a costly stalemate that drained rebel momentum. King Edward II, though a far weaker ruler than his father, could still muster overwhelming force. A royal army marched into Glamorgan, and with his men starving and his cause cornered, Llywelyn Bren made a heartbreaking choice. To spare his followers further slaughter, he surrendered personally. His hope was for mercy, or at least honorable terms. He received neither. Taken to Cardiff, he was executed as a traitor, his rebellion crushed as thoroughly as Madog's had been. LLWCHWR showed the spirit was still alive, but carefully proved the new system of control was simply too strong to break. The castles were more than buildings. They were the unyielding bones of the conquest, and against them, the sharpest ambush could only ever be a fleeting wound. The execution of Llywelyn was a grim punctuation mark, but the story of Welsh resistance refused to end with a period. Just 7 years later, in 1322, the hills echoed with the sounds of battle once more, yet this time the conflict wore a confusing new face. This was the Battle of Cadfan, a clash that reveals a painful truth about Wales in the early 14th century. The Welsh were no longer masters of their own fate, but pieces on a chessboard controlled by English nobles. The war was not for Welsh independence, but part of a vicious English civil war known as the Despencer War, a struggle between King Edward II and a coalition of rebellious marcher lords who despised the king's favourite, Hugh Despencer the Younger. Despencer had greedily seized lands in South Wales, making powerful enemies of the local marcher families like the Mortimers. When these lords rose in rebellion, they raised their armies from their Welsh estates. So at Cadfan, in the rugged terrain of Meirionydd, a force loyal to the rebel marcher lords, comprised largely of Welsh soldiers, met an army sent by the king to crush the revolt. Think about that for a moment. Welshmen were now fighting and dying in a quarrel between English magnates, their loyalty commanded by the foreign lord who controlled their land. The battle itself was a sharp, brutal affair in the classic Welsh style, an ambush or meeting engagement in difficult country where local knowledge gave the rebel force an edge. The king's men were defeated, a tactical victory for the rebel faction. But what did this win mean for Wales? Very little in the grand scheme. It was a momentary advantage in someone else's war. The complexity of Welsh allegiance in this period cannot be overstated. For a Welsh spearman following his marcher lord into battle, his immediate enemy might be the king's Welsh troops from a different region. Their participation was not for a national cause, but often out of feudal obligation, payment, or a deeply personal loyalty to a specific lord's household. Yet within this tangled web of foreign conflict, slivers of opportunity sometimes appeared. A local Welsh community might support a rebel lord not out of love for him, but because his victory could weaken the crown's oppressive sheriff in their district. A successful raid might net supplies or temporarily disrupt the collection of heavy taxes. The Battle of Cadfan, therefore, is a window into a murky transitional era. The dream of a sovereign Wales under its own prince was gone, replaced by a harsh reality where Welsh martial spirit was a commodity to be hired, a tool to be used in the internal squabbles of their conquerors. It was a subtle, demeaning form of control, turning the warriors who once defended the land into instruments of its ongoing subjugation. But even pawns can sometimes shape the game, and the next great explosion of violence would prove that the Welsh had not forgotten how to fight for themselves, even if the banner they rallied under was, once again, not entirely their own. The pawns were growing restless, and one man finally decided to move his own piece. In the year 1401, a Welsh squire named Owain Glyndŵr, slighted in a land dispute with his English neighbour, declared himself Prince of Wales. His first act was not a grand speech but a raid. On a September night, he and a small band of followers descended on the town beneath the immense walls of Caernarfon Castle. The assault on Tuthill, the settlement's high ground, was a symbolic strike at the very heart of English power in the north. They set fires, seized supplies, and fought a sharp, chaotic skirmish with the garrison before melting back into the darkness. Militarily, it was a pinprick. Psychologically, it was a thunderclap. For decades, the castles had seemed untouchable, their shadows a permanent fact of life. Glyndŵr proved they were not. He had publicly spat in the eye of the king's greatest fortress, and he had gotten away with it. That single, defiant act was a signal flare seen across Wales. It told every disgruntled farmer, every oppressed bard, every descendant of the old princes that resistance was not just a memory, it was a living man with a plan. The revolt, smoldering for years, now had a face and a flame. But a raid on a town is one thing, defeating a royal army in the field is another. That test came the following summer, on the 22nd of June, 1402, at a place called Bryn Glas, the Blue Hill near Pillith. Here, Glyndŵr crafted a trap that would become a legend. An English force led by Sir Edmund Mortimer, a major marcher lord, was marching to relieve another besieged castle. Glyndŵr chose his ground with the precision of a master hunter. He positioned his main force on the steep, thickly wooded slopes of Bryn Glas, a natural amphitheater of death. Below him lay a gentle valley, a perfect killing ground. As Mortimer's column, confident and strung out, entered the valley, the first arrows flew. But this was not a hailstorm from one direction. Glyndŵr had hidden smaller groups of archers in the woods on the opposite slope as well. The English found themselves in a crossfire, with missiles slicing into their ranks from both sides. The order and cohesion of a professional army began to dissolve into panic. Then, from the crest of Bryn Glas, Glyndŵr's infantry charged. They did not run down the hill, they used its steepness, launching themselves downward with terrifying momentum, their long spears leveled like a moving thicket. The impact on the disorganized English was catastrophic. The slope multiplied the force of the charge tenfold. The battle line shattered almost instantly. What followed was not a fight, but a slaughter and a rout. Hundreds of English soldiers were killed, many drowning in the river Lugg as they fled. Sir Edmund Mortimer himself was pulled from his horse and captured alive. The strategic genius of Bryn Glas was matched only by its political aftershock. King Henry IV, cash-strapped and suspicious of Mortimer's powerful family, refused to pay the ransom for his own commander. This was a staggering miscalculation. Humiliated and abandoned, Mortimer did the unthinkable. From his captivity, he negotiated an alliance with Glyndŵr, married the Welsh prince's daughter, and henceforth fought alongside the man who had captured him. This turn was a seismic event. It legitimized Glyndŵr's revolt in the eyes of the English nobility, showing his cause was not mere banditry but a serious political alternative. It also split the loyalties of the marcher lords, some of whom now saw their own king as a greater threat than the Welsh rebel. Bryn Glas was far more than a battlefield victory. It was the moment a rebellion became a war for a nation's soul. It proved Glyndŵr could outthink and destroy a royal army, and it gifted him a high-born English ally. The message was clear to all of Wales and terrifying to the English crown. The ghost of Llywelyn the Last had returned, and this time he knew how to win. The triumph at Bryn Glas had opened the door, and Owain Glyndŵr now strode through it. His next targets were not armies in the field, but the very symbols of English domination, the mighty castles of King Edward I. To capture one of these fortresses would be more than a military victory. It would be a profound psychological reversal. His first and greatest prize was Harlech. Perched on a dramatic cliff overlooking the sea, Harlech was a masterpiece of concentric design, a castle within a castle, considered virtually impregnable. Its strength, however, was also its weakness. A castle needs a large garrison to man its vast walls, and those men must be fed and paid. By 1404, after years of rebellion, the English crown was stretched thin. The garrison at Harlech, isolated and likely demoralized as Glyndŵr's influence grew around them, found itself under siege not just by Welsh forces but by neglect from London. The details of the capture are shrouded in some mystery, but it seems to have been a combination of careful blockade and perhaps internal treachery or surrender from a garrison that saw no hope of relief. However it happened, the result was transformative. Harlech did not fall to a storm of arrows or a battering ram, it changed hands. And with that change, it transformed from a tool of oppression into the seat of a Welsh prince. Glyndŵr moved his family into the royal apartments. He held his parliament in its great halls. From Harlech, he issued charters, received foreign diplomats, and administered justice. This was no longer a rebel hideout, it was a capital. The castle built to subdue Wales had become the command center for its liberation, a fact that must have felt like poetic justice to every Welshman who saw its towers against the sky. But Glyndŵr's ambition reached even further. If Harlech could be taken, why not the greatest of them all? Why not Conwy? This castle, with its immense walls and 8 towering turrets fused directly into the rocky outcrop of a coastal town, was the crown jewel of Edward's Iron Ring. Its capture seemed a fantasy, yet on Palm Sunday 1401, a fantasy nearly came true. The plan relied on stealth and cunning, not siege engines. A small band of Welshmen, led by 2 brothers named Rhys and Gwilym ap Tewdwr, approached the castle town. It was a holy day, and the gates between the town and the castle itself were likely open for worshippers. The Welshmen disguised themselves as carpenters, perhaps carrying tools to blend in. They mingled with the crowd, moving slowly closer to the castle gate. Then, in a moment of breathtaking audacity, they rushed the entrance, overpowering the few guards before the massive doors could be slammed shut. In an instant, they were inside the mightiest fortress in Wales. They held Conwy Castle for a full 2 months. Think about that. A handful of men, through sheer nerve and a perfect trick, had seized the ultimate symbol of English power. Of course, they could not hold it forever. A large English army eventually arrived and retook the castle, but the damage to English prestige was already done. The psychological impact of these 2 sieges, Harlech and Conwy, was immeasurable. They proved that Edward's invincible stone giants were vulnerable. They could be starved out, tricked, or turned. For the Welsh, it was the ultimate validation, a sign that the old order was not just being challenged but physically occupied. Glyndŵr ruling from Harlech was the peak of his power, the moment the dream of an independent Wales felt tangible, a kingdom with a castle, a prince, and a parliament. Yet such heights are precarious, and the view from the battlements of Harlech would soon reveal a gathering storm, as the English crown, humiliated and furious, began to marshal its vast resources for a final, crushing response. A prince needs more than a castle, he needs a kingdom. And for Owain Glyndŵr, the true test of his national authority lay in the fertile, populous south. Here, in the ancient lands of Glamorgan and Deheubarth, the old Marcher lords still held sway, and English administration was deeply rooted. To be recognized as Prince of all Wales, Glyndŵr had to prove he could not just raid but conquer and hold. That proof came in 2 decisive blows, the Battle of Stalling Down in 1403 and the Siege of Carmarthen in 1405. Stalling Down was a rarity, a large-scale, set-piece battle on open ground near Cowbridge. An English army, raised to crush the rebellion in Glamorgan, marched out to meet Glyndŵr's forces. The Welsh army, however, was no longer just a band of guerrillas. By this point, it included seasoned soldiers, disaffected Welsh gentry, and, according to some chronicles, a contingent of French knights and men-at-arms, the first trickle of promised aid from Glyndŵr's continental allies. The presence of these professional soldiers likely gave the Welsh ranks a new discipline. The battle itself was a brutal, head-on clash. Glyndŵr's army, fighting on ground of their own choosing, met the English charge and shattered it. The victory was total, breaking English military power in Glamorgan and allowing Glyndŵr to sweep through the region, capturing key strongholds and finally bringing the wealth and manpower of the south under his banner. With Glamorgan secured, the next logical target was Carmarthen. This was not just another castle town, it was the most important administrative centre in all of South Wales, the seat of royal justice and finance. Controlling Carmarthen meant controlling the flow of law, money, and information for the entire region. Its capture would be the ultimate declaration that English rule was over. The siege in 1405 was a major operation. Glyndŵr's forces, now a true national army, surrounded the town and its castle. The details are sparse, but the outcome is clear after a determined assault or perhaps a negotiated surrender from a trapped garrison. Carmarthen fell. This was a victory of immense strategic value. It gave Glyndŵr a second capital in the south, a counterbalance to his northern base at Harlech. More importantly, it secured the vital river port on the Tywr, a gateway to the sea. This was the lifeline for his ambitions. Through ports like Carmarthen, the promised French reinforcements, weapons, and supplies could flow directly into the heart of his territory. For a fleeting moment, Glyndŵr's map was complete. He held the north from Harlech, the center from his mountain strongholds, and now the south from Carmarthen. He was, in fact as well as in name, the Prince of Wales. Yet maps drawn in blood can be quickly redrawn, and the very ports that brought him hope would soon witness the arrival of a storm that no castle walls, no matter how thick, could withstand. But the tide of war is a cruel and fickle thing. Just months after the triumph at Carmarthen, the rebellion suffered two catastrophic blows in quick succession. Defeats that would puncture the dream of a Welsh nation and reveal a new, ruthless English strategy. The first came at a place called Llywelyn, the Yellow Pool, near Usk in the spring of 1405. A Welsh force commanded by Owain Glyndŵr's own brother Tudur was maneuvering in the region, likely seeking to consolidate control. They were intercepted by an English army led by the marcher Lord Richard Grey. The battle that followed was a brutal, close-quarters engagement. The Welsh fought fiercely, but they were outmaneuvered and overwhelmed. In the chaos of the fighting, Tudur Glyndŵr was cut down and killed. Worse still, Owain's son, Griffith, was captured and taken prisoner. The loss was more than tactical. It was a deep, personal wound to the heart of the rebellion. Tudur was not just a commander, he was a trusted brother and a pillar of the cause. Griffith was the prince's heir, the future of the dynasty Glyndŵr was trying to build. His capture was a hostage situation of the highest order, a sword of Damocles hanging over Owain's head. Llywelyn shattered the aura of invincibility that had surrounded Glyndŵr's military leadership. The second hammer blow fell almost immediately afterward, just a few miles away at Grosmont. Here, the English field commander was a young man who would soon become a legend of warfare, Prince Henry of Monmouth, the future King Henry V. Henry did not wait behind castle walls. He took the fight directly to the Welsh, leading a swift, aggressive strike against a rebel force encamped near the town. The Battle of Grosmont was a masterclass in decisive action. Henry's men, likely a mix of professional men-at-arms and skilled archers, caught the Welsh by surprise and routed them completely. Chroniclers report heavy Welsh casualties, a devastating loss of experienced soldiers that the rebellion could scarcely afford. These two defeats, Llywelyn and Grosmont, marked a profound and irreversible turning point. They demonstrated that the English had finally adapted. No longer were they merely reacting to Glyndŵr's raids or sitting in besieged castles. Under leaders like Prince Henry, they adopted a brutal, proactive tactic known as the chevauchée. This was not about holding ground, it was about destroying the enemy's ability to fight. English armies began to march deep into Welsh territory, not to conquer castles but to burn. They torched crops, slaughtered livestock, and razed homesteads and entire villages to the ground. The goal was to cripple the economic base of the rebellion, to starve both the Welsh armies and the population that supported them. It was total war against the land itself. For a rebellion sustained by local support and hidden in the mountains, this was a poison it could not withstand. Morale, which had soared after Harlech and Carmarthen, now plummeted. How could you fight for a prince when your family was starving and your home was ashes? The chevauchée raid systematically unraveled the fabric of Glyndŵr's Wales, proving that even the most inspired leader could not defend against an enemy willing to wage war on the very soil his people needed to survive. The dream was not just fading, it was being burned to the ground, acre by painful acre. fire is hardest to extinguish when it burns in familiar ground. Even as Prince Henry's chevauchée raids scorched the valleys, the rebellion's embers still glowed fiercely in its northern heartlands. In 1405, the year of those crippling defeats, a final, defiant flame erupted at a place called Bryn Owain, the Hill of Owain near Anfair in Caernarfonshire. This battle was a classic Glyndŵr ambush, a return to the tactics that had won Bryn Glas. A substantial English force, likely a column sent to pacify the region, was marching through the rugged terrain. Glyndŵr's men, hidden on the wooded slopes of the hill, watched and waited. At the perfect moment, they unleashed a storm of arrows followed by a furious downhill charge. The English, caught in a narrow pass, had no room to maneuver or form a proper defensive line. The fighting was savage and close, a desperate melee where local knowledge and ferocity triumphed over discipline. The English column was shattered, its survivors sent fleeing. Bryn Owain was a significant local victory, a clear message that the north remained unconquered. It proved that in the right terrain, the Welsh spirit could still break an English army, but it was also the last major field victory Glyndŵr would ever achieve. It was a brilliant flash of the old magic, illuminating a landscape that was everywhere else growing dark. That flickering light now focused on a single, stubborn point on the map, the coastal fortress of Aberystwyth. If Harlech was Glyndŵr's northern capital, Aberystwyth was its southern sister, another of Edward I's great castles that had fallen into Welsh hands. By 1407, it was the last major stronghold still openly flying Glyndŵr's banner, a lone rock against an incoming tide. The English knew that to end the rebellion, they had to take it back. What followed was not a quick assault, but an epic, grinding siege that would last for over a year, a medieval battle of wills and engineering. The Siege of Aberystwyth is a story of technological escalation. The English surrounded the castle with earthworks and began a steady bombardment, but inside the walls the defenders had a secret weapon, or rather, a promised one. Glyndŵr's alliance with France finally bore tangible fruit, not in the form of a vast army, but in something perhaps more valuable for a siege: specialist military engineers and, critically, cannon. These were not the giant bombards of later centuries, but early gunpowder weapons, capable of hurling stone shot to smash masonry and shatter morale. For a time, the castle became a buzzing workshop of international resistance. French engineers directed Welsh laborers to strengthen the defenses, while their own cannon fired back from the battlements. The siege became a stalemate, a brutal back and forth of mining, countermining, and thunderous artillery duels across the walls. It was a war of attrition in its purest form, and attrition favors the side with the deeper resources. The English lines were constantly reinforced and resupplied by sea. Inside Aberystwyth, however, the situation grew dire. Food stores dwindled, gunpowder ran low, and the promised flood of French reinforcements never arrived in force. The garrison, a mix of Welsh loyalists and a handful of French soldiers, was worn down by constant bombardment and growing hunger. After holding out with incredible tenacity for more than 12 months, the defenders faced a hopeless choice. In 1408, they negotiated a truce. The terms were stark: they would surrender the castle in exchange for their lives and safe passage. There was no last-minute relief, no glorious charge. Aberystwyth simply gave up. The castle gates opened, and the last great fortress of the rebellion passed back into English hands. The fall of Aberystwyth was a death knell. It demonstrated with cruel clarity that even with foreign expertise and heroic endurance, Wales could not win a sustained war of logistics against the English crown. The rebellion could bleed its enemy, but it could not outlast him. With Aberystwyth gone, only Harlech remained, an island in a sea of ash and despair. Harlech Castle stood alone, a final island of defiance in a conquered sea. By 1409, every other major fortress had fallen. The rebellion had been pushed back to its last rock, and the English crown, under the now relentless Prince Henry, was determined to smash it for good. The siege of Harlech was the final, brutal act of a 15-year war. Unlike the earlier sieges, there would be no clever tricks or negotiated truces this time. The English surrounded the castle completely by land and by sea, cutting off any hope of escape or resupply. Inside those magnificent walls were Glyndŵr's most precious treasures, his wife, his daughters, and his grandchildren, along with his brother-in-law and staunch ally Edmund Mortimer. They were not just a family, they were the living heart of the rebellion's future. The siege was a grim exercise in starvation and pressure. Month after month, the noose tightened. Food ran out. Morale, even among the most loyal, must have crumbled as the English bombardment continued and the Welsh countryside beyond lay silent, no army marching to their relief. The end, when it came, was not a glorious last stand, but a tragic collapse. The castle was finally stormed. In the chaotic and bloody final assault, Edmund Mortimer was killed. Glyndŵr's family, his wife and children, were captured alive. They were taken as prisoners to the Tower of London, where they would later die, their line extinguished in captivity. But the greatest loss in that storm was not of people, but of memory. Harlech was not just a fortress, it was a state archive. Within its walls were Glyndŵr's letters, his treaties with France and Scotland, the records of his parliaments, the seals and charters that documented the entire administrative machinery of his principality. When the castle fell, this archive, this paper proof of a functioning Welsh state, vanished. It was likely looted, burned, or deliberately destroyed. The English conquest was not just physical, it was historical. They sought to erase the very evidence that Glyndŵr's Wales had ever been a real governing entity. With Harlech's fall, the organized rebellion was over. Yet one man was not in the castle when it fell. Owain Glyndŵr himself was gone. He had slipped into the misty, mountainous heart of Wales, a fugitive in his own land with a price on his head. And then he simply disappeared. After 1412, all reliable historical record of him ceases. He becomes a ghost. This vanishing act created the greatest enduring mystery of the entire Welsh Wars. What happened to Owain Glyndŵr? Theories have swirled for centuries. Some say he died quietly in hiding, perhaps at the home of one of his few remaining loyal daughters, his body secretly buried in an unmarked grave to avoid desecration by his enemies. Other, more romantic tales suggest he never died at all, that he fled to England and lived out his days in disguise, a monk in a quiet monastery, watching the world forget. But the most powerful theory is neither of death nor disguise, but of deliberate, chosen disappearance. He knew his cause was lost, but he also knew that a captured or slain prince becomes a martyr with a fixed ending. A vanished prince, however, becomes a legend with no end. He could become a symbol, a sleeping hero like King Arthur, waiting in a cave for the trumpet call to return and save his people in their hour of greatest need. This idea that Glyndŵr would one day return became a potent folk belief that sustained Welsh identity through centuries of oppression. His absence was more powerful than any grave. It made him a perpetual presence, a reminder that the spirit of resistance could never be truly captured or killed. He transformed from a failed rebel into an eternal icon, the last native prince of Wales, whose empty throne was a silent promise that the story was not over. And in that mysterious silence, a question lingered: if a prince could vanish, could a nation's hope ever truly be extinguished? The ghost of Glyndŵr haunted the hills, but the ambitions of Welshmen now found a new and dangerous stage. For decades after the rebellion, Wales was a land subdued, its people governed by harsh penal laws. Yet the very chaos that crushed their independence soon created a bizarre opportunity, as the Great Dynastic War, known as the Wars of the Roses, tore England apart. In this conflict between the houses of York and Lancaster, the Welsh were no longer fighting for their own prince, but were mustered as crucial manpower for English magnates. The Battle of Banbury in 1469 is a perfect, brutal example of this strange new reality. The Yorkist king, Edward IV, faced a rebellion from his own former ally, the Earl of Warwick. To counter this, Edward sent two armies marching toward a rendezvous. One was led by the Earl of Pembroke, a man whose power base was deep in Wales. Pembroke's force was not a professional royal army. It was an army of Wales itself, a host of fierce Welsh pikemen and archers raised from the lordships of the south and west. These men were fighting for a Yorkist lord, but in their hearts they may have been fighting for pay, for the promise of plunder, or for the prestige of their local chieftain. Their morale was high, their weapons sharp, but at Banbury they met the other Yorkist army, led by the Earl of Devon, and the two commanders fell into a petty quarrel over billeting. Devon, in a fit of pique, simply marched his contingent away on the eve of the battle. Pembroke was left alone on the field, his Welsh pikemen now facing the full force of the rebel Lancastrian army. What followed was a disaster born of political folly. The Welsh infantry formed their traditional schiltron, a dense hedge of long pikes that could stop a cavalry charge. And initially they held, but without Devon's archers to support them, they were a static target. The Lancastrian forces enveloped them, and the deadly English longbowmen, the very weapon that had won at Mies Moydog, found their mark again. A storm of arrows poured into the packed Welsh ranks. Then the cavalry charged the disrupted formations. The fighting was merciless. Pembroke's Welsh army was annihilated, and he himself was captured and later executed. The impact was immediate. This defeat, caused by English squabbling, temporarily broke the Yorkist power in the region and threw King Edward's reign into crisis. But the deeper lesson of Banbury was about Wallace's place in this new order. The battle demonstrated that Welsh military power was still a formidable factor, so much so that English lords depended on it. Yet it also showed how expendable that power was in the eyes of those same lords. Welsh lives were the currency of English civil wars, spent freely in quarrels they did not start. Yet from this bloody exchange rate, a new kind of fortune was being minted. In the swirling chaos of the Wars of the Roses, other Welsh families were learning to play a longer and more cunning game. One such family watched these events closely from their estates in Anglesey, a minor noble house with a claim to royal blood through marriage and a name that would soon echo through history, the Tudors. For them, the carnage at Banbury was not just a tragedy, it was a lesson in the cost of backing the wrong side and a signal that the wheel of fortune was still spinning. Their moment to place a bet was coming, and they would wager everything on a single, desperate throw of the dice, not on English soil but back in the heart of Wales itself. The wheel of fortune finally spun to a stop on a muddy field in Leicestershire in August of 1485. This was Bosworth, a battle that would not be fought on Welsh soil, but would be won by Welsh hearts and Welsh steel. Henry Tudor, the last surviving Lancastrian claimant, had spent 14 years in exile, watching the English crown tear itself apart. His landing at Milford Haven was not an invasion, but a homecoming. He marched under the Red Dragon of Cadwaladr, a banner that spoke directly to the soul of Wales. His small army of French mercenaries and exiled English lords was just a seed, but as he moved north through the Welsh countryside, that seed took root and grew into a forest. Men flocked to him not just for pay, but for prophecy. For generations, bards had sung of the Mab Darogan, the son of prophecy, a Welsh-born savior who would reclaim the throne of Britain. Henry, born in Pembroke Castle and boasting descent from the ancient Welsh princes through his grandfather Owain Tudor, fit that myth perfectly. He was the promised return, not of Glyndŵr, but of a legitimacy that bypassed the bloody squabbles of York and Lancaster. His most crucial recruit was a man who held the keys to South Wales, Rhys ap Thomas. A powerful local magnate, Rhys had sworn a notorious oath to King Richard III, vowing that Henry would only enter Wales over his belly. But the call of blood and prophecy proved stronger than any oath to a Yorkist king. Rhys met Henry not as an enemy but as a supplicant, literally laying down in the mud so Henry could step symbolically over him, thus technically fulfilling the vow. With this act of political theatre, Rhys brought his formidable private army of Welsh pikemen and archers into the Tudor fold. This was the turning point. Henry's force was no longer a band of exiles, it was a national host. As they crossed into England, they were an army of destiny, with Welshmen forming its hardened core. On the 22nd of August, they faced King Richard's larger, veteran army at Bosworth Field. The battle was a chaotic melee in the rain, but the Welsh troops under Rhys ap Thomas held the crucial left flank. When Richard, in a desperate gamble, led a direct cavalry charge aimed at killing Henry Tudor himself, it was these Welsh formations that helped blunt the attack. The death of Richard III on the field, betrayed in part by other English nobles who held back, marked the instant end of an era. The crown, literally plucked from a thorn bush, was placed on Henry Tudor's head. A Welsh-descended king now ruled England. The victory at Bosworth did more than end the Wars of the Roses. It rewrote the relationship between conqueror and conquered. Henry VII, first of the Tudor dynasty, immediately incorporated the Red Dragon of Wales into the royal coat of arms. He named his firstborn son Arthur in deliberate homage to the Celtic mythic past. The penal laws against the Welsh were gradually relaxed, and Welshmen found new avenues into the English court and administration. In a profound irony, the long Welsh Wars for independence culminated not in a sovereign state, but in the peaceful conquest of the conqueror's throne. The people who had fought for centuries to keep their identity had now provided the lineage for a new British monarchy. The Mab Darogan had arrived, but his kingdom was not a restored Wales. It was a united realm where the dragon flew beside the lion. The old battles for land and law were over, replaced by a subtler, more personal victory. The blood of the Welsh princes now flowed in the veins of the King of England. And from this unexpected union, a new question would arise: what becomes of a warrior culture when the war is finally won, not on a mountain pass but in the halls of power? 2 centuries after Bosworth, the dragon's descendants presided over a kingdom tearing itself apart. The great conflict was no longer between England and Wales, but within Britain itself, a war of king against parliament, of faith against faith. And in the spring of 1648, this civil war returned to Welsh soil for its final, thunderous act. The Battle of St. Fagans, just outside Cardiff, was not a clash of medieval princes, but a brutal meeting of the first modern armies Britain had ever seen. On one side stood veteran regiments of the new model army, Parliament's disciplined professional force. On the other was a royalist army, a mix of local Welsh gentry, their tenants, and a corps of experienced officers who had once fought for the king. This was the Second English Civil War, a last desperate uprising against the parliamentary victory. Wales, with its strong royalist traditions, had become a fortress for the king's cause once more. But the force marching to meet them at St. Fagans represented a new kind of power. The new model army was not a feudal levy. Its soldiers were paid, drilled, and motivated by radical political and religious ideals. They fought not for a local lord, but for an idea. The battle itself was a masterclass in this new professionalism. The parliamentarian commander, Colonel Thomas Horton, chose his ground carefully on a ridge, forcing the royalists to attack uphill. He used his cavalry not as a blunt instrument, but with controlled precision, holding them back until the perfect moment. The fighting was fierce and lasted for hours, a relentless exchange of musket volleys and cavalry charges across the open fields. But discipline and cohesion won the day. The royalist lines, brave but less organized, finally broke under the sustained pressure. The rout was total. St. Fagans was the largest battle ever fought on Welsh soil, involving over 11,000 men. Its outcome was catastrophic for the royalist cause. With this defeat, the last major royalist field army in Wales was destroyed. Every remaining castle and town holding out for the king now stood isolated, with no hope of relief. Within months, the great sieges of Pembroke and Anglesey would fall, extinguishing the flame of armed royalism in Wales forever. Parliament's control was now absolute and unchallengeable. The battle's significance echoed far beyond the local fields. It demonstrated the overwhelming effectiveness of a standing, professional army over traditional forces. It secured the rear of the new model army, allowing Oliver Cromwell to march north to his decisive victory at Preston. But most profoundly, St Fagans marked the end of Wales as a distinct military and political entity in Britain's internal wars. The age of the Welsh prince leading a national host was a distant memory. Now, Welshmen fought and died under the banners of British factions, their homeland merely a theatre in a larger struggle for the soul of a kingdom. The Red Dragon no longer led armies into battle. It watched from the royal standard as new kinds of warriors decided the future on ancient ground. Yet the thunder of cannon and the clash of pikes eventually gave way to a far more curious sound on the Welsh coast, the confused murmur of a drunken, threadbare invasion. In February of 1797, a chapter that had begun with Norman knights and defiant princes ended not with a roar, but with a whimper on the rocky shores of Pembrokeshire. This was the Battle of Fishguard, often remembered as the last invasion of mainland Britain, and it unfolded with a strangeness that feels almost fictional. A small French expedition, part of the Revolutionary Wars, set sail with grand ambitions to stir rebellion in Britain. Their ships were not packed with elite troops, however, but with a ragtag force of convicts and irregulars, many of them press-ganged into service. Their commander, an American adventurer named William Tate, was promised a legion of fierce fighters, but what he landed near Fishguard was a shivering, ill-disciplined mob more interested in loot than liberty. They came ashore and promptly found a warehouse full of Portuguese wine. What followed was less a military occupation and more a disastrous village fate. The invaders became hopelessly drunk, stumbling through the countryside and pilfering from farms, their discipline evaporating by the hour. The local response, however, was swift and surprisingly organized. Lord Cawdor, a local nobleman, gathered the Pembrokeshire yeomanry and militia, along with a great many ordinary townsfolk and farmers armed with whatever they had. The stage was set for a confrontation, but the most famous moment of the battle involved no fighting at all. As the story goes, a group of Welsh women from the nearby village of Da, dressed in their traditional tall black hats and striking red cloaks, gathered on a hillside to watch the unfolding chaos. From a distance, through the grey winter light, the French mistook these women for a line of British redcoat soldiers, fresh reinforcements arriving in overwhelming numbers. This mistaken identity, whether entirely true or embellished by legend, shattered the already fragile French morale. Convinced they were outnumbered and surrounded, and with his men incapacitated by drink and disorder, Colonel Tate had little choice. After just 2 days on Welsh soil without any significant combat, he marched his bedraggled force to a field near Goodwick and surrendered unconditionally to Lord Cawdor's amateur army. The battle was over, the invasion finished by local farmers and the spectral impression of women in red. Fishguard's comedy, however, should not obscure its profound symbolism. This fiasco marked the absolute, final end of foreign military incursions onto Welsh territory. The long arc that began with Norman castles and reached its climax with Glyndŵr's parliament and the Tudor ascent, concluded here with a hungover surrender to a county militia. The mighty engines of war that had shaped Wales for 7 centuries, the longbows and the trebuchets, the pikes and the cavalry charges, were now relics. The threat was no longer from rival princes or conquering kings, but from the confused spillover of continental revolutions, and it was dealt with not by a national army, but by the community itself. Fishguard is the historical postscript, a quiet punchline after an epic and tragic saga. It tells us that the age of Wales as a battleground for empires and dynasties was irrevocably closed. The Red Dragon no longer needed to guard the shores from foreign fleets, for the wars to come would be different, fought on global scales far from these ancient hills. The land itself seemed to sigh, its soil finally free from the tramp of invasion, leaving only the wind and the waves and the faint, fading echo of a conflict that had lasted 1,000 years. The echoes of Fishguard had long faded, replaced by a new and terrible kind of silence. For centuries, the Welsh had defended their hills against invasion. In the summer of 1916, they were asked to leave those hills and cross the sea to fight for the empire that had once conquered them, in a war that would redefine the very meaning of sacrifice. The 30th and final battle in our long journey is not fought with longbows against knights, but with bayonets against machine guns. It is the Battle of Mamet's Wood, a name that would become seared into the soul of modern Wales. This was not a clash for territory or a prince's crown, but part of the immense, grinding horror of the Somme. The objective was a dense, splintered forest held by seasoned German troops, a natural fortress of shattered timber and hidden nests of steel. To take it, they sent in the 38th Welsh Division. For these men, the journey to that French wood was a paradox. They were soldiers of the British Army, yet they marched under the leek, the ancient Welsh symbol. They came from the valleys and the mining towns, communities with names that remembered Glyndŵr and Llywelyn. Now they were asked to advance across open fields in broad daylight toward a wood that vomited continuous machine gun fire. The initial attacks were catastrophic. Lines of Welsh infantry were cut down by interlocking fields of fire before they even reached the tree line. The wood itself, when they finally clawed their way into it, was a nightmare realm. It was not a clean forest, but a grotesque sculpture of broken branches, tangled wire, and fallen trunks, all churned by weeks of artillery. Visibility was a few feet. Danger came from everywhere, from snipers perched high in the shattered oaks, from machine gun teams hidden in shell craters, from sudden, vicious counterattacks through the thick undergrowth. The fighting that followed was some of the most brutal close-quarters combat of the entire war. It was a battle of small groups, of bayonets and grenades, of desperate men crawling through mud and blood to silence a chattering gun emplacement. There was no grand tactic, only relentless, costly pressure. For 5 days, the Welsh division inched forward, clearing the wood trench by trench, strong point by strong point. The cost was almost beyond comprehension. By the time the wood was finally secured, the division had suffered over 4,000 casualties. An entire generation from tight-knit Welsh communities was left bleeding in that French soil. This was not a victory in any traditional sense. It was a completion of a horrifying task, a piece of ground taken at a price that felt, and still feels, untenable. Yet, in the decades that followed, Mamet's Wood grew into something far larger than a military objective. It became a modern Welsh epic, a story of courage and catastrophic loss that resonated with the ancient struggles we have traced. The battle was immortalized not in chronicles of princes, but in the poetry of soldiers like Siegfried Sassoon, and later in the searing paintings of Christopher Williams and the words of modern Welsh poets. These artists asked the same painful questions the medieval bards might have asked after Bryn Derwen or Castell y Berra. What is the value of such sacrifice? What does it do to the soul of a people? The men who fought at Mamet's Wood were not fighting for an independent Wales, but their identity as Welshmen was central to how they were remembered and how they remembered themselves. Their courage under that unimaginable fire was seen as a continuation of a long lineage, the same stubborn fortitude that held the slopes of Crugmawr and charged down Bryn Glas. So we end our journey not with a castle's fall or a prince's coronation, but in the shattered silence of a 20th century wood. The Battle of Mamet's Wood stands as a terrible, symbolic bookend to 1,000 years of conflict. It marks the moment the Welsh martial spirit, forged in the fires of medieval resistance, was expended on a global stage for a cause far removed from its origins. The struggle for land and law was over. What remained was the struggle for memory, for meaning, and for an identity that could endure even the mechanized horror of modern war. The red dragon was now a patch on a uniform, but the heart that beat beneath it still carried the echo of older battles, a deep, unbroken rhythm of loyalty, loss, and an unyielding will to stand firm in the face of the storm, no matter where that storm might rage. The ghosts of those battles are not confined to memory. They are embedded in the very earth and stone of Wales itself. The most visible legacy is a crown of fortresses, Edward I's so-called Iron Ring, a necklace of stone drawn tight around the neck of Gwynedd. Conwy, Caernarfon, Harlech, and Beaumaris were not mere garrison posts. They were statements in limestone and sandstone. Their purpose was absolute control, to dominate the landscape visually and militarily, ensuring that no Welsh prince could ever again rally the north. They were supplied by sea, making them immune to traditional siege, and their sheer, intimidating scale was designed to crush the spirit of rebellion before it could even form. Yet, in a profound historical irony, these instruments of subjugation have become the very symbols of Welsh heritage. Their stark, majestic beauty now draws visitors from across the world, their walls telling a story of oppression that, over centuries, has been reclaimed as one of breathtaking human achievement. They stand as complex monuments where the narrative of conquest has slowly intertwined with one of national pride. But the true fortress of Wales was never built by foreign hands. It was the land itself, the jagged peaks of Snowdonia, the dense, rain-swept forests of the Ceiriog Valley, the steep-sided river valleys of the south. These were the natural ramparts that defined 1,000 years of warfare. This terrain dictated a specific kind of war, the guerrilla tactics that became the Welsh signature. An English army with its heavy cavalry and long supply trains was a beast built for open fields. In the narrow mountain passes and tangled woods of Wales, that beast was blind, slow, and vulnerable. The Welsh became masters of the ambush, using the land as a force multiplier. They knew where the ground turned to bog under a knight's charger, which ridge offered a clear line of sight for archers, which forest path led to a dead end. The landscape was not just a backdrop to their resistance, it was an active participant, a silent ally that swallowed invading armies whole. This intimate relationship with a rugged homeland forged a unique national identity, one rooted in resilience, local knowledge, and a fierce connection to place. This martial dialogue with the landscape stretches back far beyond the medieval princes. The Welsh Wars are written in layers across the country, a palimpsest of defense. Iron Age hill forts, those ancient crowns on lonely summits, were often reused by Welsh forces as lookout posts or temporary strongholds. The Romans built forts that later provided stone for Norman castles. A Norman motte and bailey might be erected atop a Welsh royal elles or court. Every conquest built upon the ruins of the last, each generation repurposing the strategic logic of those who came before. To walk the Welsh countryside is to traverse a living museum of military history, where a grassy mound might conceal 1,000 years of silent sentinels, and a castle wall might tell two stories, one of its English builder's might, and another of the Welsh prince who later turned it into his own capital. The legacy is not just in the grand castles, but in the quiet, overgrown ditches of forgotten forts, in the paths trodden by generations of warriors, and in the enduring spirit of a people who learned to see every mountain, every forest, and every river as a weapon and a shield in the endless fight for home. But steel and stone were only part of the arsenal. In the shadows and in the songs, another war was always being waged, a battle for hearts and minds fought with whispers, poetry, and ancient dreams. This was the unseen warfare, where a spy's rumor could doom a castle as surely as a siege engine, and a bard's verse could raise an army from a quiet hillside. In a land of such formidable terrain, information was the most precious currency. messengers and spies, often disguised as pilgrims, peddlers, or simple farmers, moved along hidden mountain paths known only to locals. They carried coded messages between princes, reports on English troop movements, and vital news of alliances. A single man slipping through a forest at night could be the difference between a successful ambush and walking into a trap. This network of clandestine communication turned the very isolation of Wales into a strength, allowing resistance to coordinate across great distances, invisible to the occupying forces. Yet the true keepers of the flame were not the spies but the bards. The bardic tradition was the living memory and the beating heart of Wales. These highly trained poets were not mere entertainers, they were historians, genealogists, and master propagandists. In a society without widespread literacy, they were the archivists. They memorized the lineages of princes back for generations, preserving the legal claims to land and title that English law sought to erase. After a battle like Crug Mawr or Bryn Glas, it was the bards who composed the stirring accounts, transforming raw events into epic poetry. Their verses, performed in the halls of local lords, did more than record history, they shaped it. They celebrated Welsh heroes and mocked English failures, weaving tales of courage that fueled national pride and stiffened resolve for the next fight. A bard's praise could secure a lord's legacy, and his satire could destroy a rival's reputation. They were the master storytellers of resistance, ensuring that every victory, no matter how temporary, was etched into the cultural consciousness. This cultural warfare reached its mystical zenith with the power of prophecy. The Welsh landscape was haunted by ancient predictions, most famously those attributed to the legendary prophet Myrddin or Merlin. These prophecies spoke in cryptic, poetic language about a future deliverer, a Mab Darogan or son of prophecy, who would arise to drive the foreigners into the sea and restore the Britons to their rightful dominion. For centuries, these stories simmered in the background, a folk memory of hope. Then came a man like Owain Glyndŵr. He and his supporters actively harnessed this potent mythology. They pointed to omens like the Great Revolt beginning during a rare eclipse as signs that the prophecies were being fulfilled. Glyndŵr presented himself not just as a disgruntled noble, but as the long-awaited figure of destiny. His bards and clerics spread this message far and wide. For a common farmer, the choice was no longer between a distant English king and a local Welsh lord. It was between oppression and the fulfillment of a sacred, centuries-old promise. This was psychological warfare of the highest order. It gave the rebellion a divine mandate, making resistance feel like a sacred duty. It offered a narrative so powerful that it could compel men to risk everything, not just for land or liberty, but for a place in a cosmic story. The English crown understood this threat deeply, which is why they persecuted the bards and tried to suppress the prophetic texts. They knew that an idea sung around a fire could be more dangerous than 1,000 spears. So while armies clashed on open fields, this other war continued in the twilight, in the verses sung softly in a smoky hall, in the secret message passed hand to hand, and in the shared dream of a golden age waiting just over the horizon. It reminds us that the most enduring victories are often won not by who holds the castle, but by who holds the story. From the misty fields of Mynydd Carn to the shattered trees of Mamet's Wood, the soil of Wales holds 1,000 years of whispered courage. We have walked through 30 battles, not as a simple list of dates, but as a single, unbroken story of defiance. It is a story where the landscape itself became a weapon, where a prince could vanish into myth, and where the song of a bard could carry the same weight as a volley of arrows. Military conquest, in the end, was achieved. Castles of stone rose and fell, borders were redrawn by statute, and the crown of England found its heir in Welsh blood. Yet to see this only as a tale of defeat is to miss the deeper, more enduring truth. The true victory was not found on any battlefield map. It was forged in the relentless, stubborn fire of cultural survival. The Welsh language, the bardic traditions, the law, the very memory of a different way of life, these were the treasures that could not be plundered or burned. They were carried in the hearts of the people through centuries of foreign rule, waiting for a quieter kind of resurgence. So as we leave these ancient fields, a question lingers not about what was lost, but about what was never truly surrendered. Looking back across this epic struggle, from the first fateful invitation at Mynydd Carn to the last tragic charge in a French wood, which moment do you believe was the most pivotal? Was it the unity at Crugmawr, the diplomacy of Llywelyn the Great, or the defiant dream of Glyndŵr? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The conversation is part of keeping the story alive. If you've enjoyed this march through history, be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the mysteries and conflicts that shaped our world. Thank you for watching.